The candles trembled when Julian Ashcombe hit the marble floor. 300 people stood in that ballroom, and every single one of them turned to look at the Duke of Ellisford sprawled at the foot of the grand staircase. His cane had slipped from his hand. His leg, wrecked years ago in a battle he never spoke of, had finally betrayed him, in front of the one crowd he could never afford to show weakness to. Laughter came first, quiet and cruel, hidden behind fans and gloved hands. Then came the worst thing, the silence. The turning away. Lords and ladies who had been fawning over him minutes earlier suddenly found their wineglasses fascinating, their conversations urgent, their eyes anywhere but on the man on the floor. Julian had faced cannon fire without flinching. This was worse. He pressed his palm flat against the cold marble and tried to push himself up before anyone could offer help he didn't want. His arms shook, his pride shook harder. Somewhere above him, a violin kept playing, absurdly cheerful, as if nothing in the world had happened. A hand appeared in front of his face. He looked up, expecting pity, already preparing the words that would cut whoever offered it. Instead, he found a woman he barely recognized, a young lady in pale green silk, kneeling right there on the ballroom floor without a shred of concern for her gown. "Give me your arm," she said, not a question, not a whisper full of sympathy, just plain instruction, the way one might tell a child to mind a step. "I don't need help," Julian said, the words sharper than he intended. "You're on the floor," she said. "I think you do." Something about her tone made him angrier than the fall itself. He grabbed his cane, refused her offered hand, and hauled himself upright through sheer stubbornness, his jaw tight against the pain screaming up his bad leg. When he finally stood, swaying slightly, she hadn't moved. She hadn't laughed either. She was simply watching him, the way one watches a door to see if it will hold. "You can look away now," Julian said, "like everyone else." Her brows lifted slightly. "Why would I do that?" "Because that is what people do," he said, voice low and cutting, meant to end the conversation. "They look away. It is kinder for both of us if you do the same." "I don't think it's kind at all," she said. "I think it's cowardice, dressed up as manners." For a moment, Julian forgot the pain in his leg entirely. No one spoke to him like that. Not since he'd inherited the title, not since the war. Not since half the ton had decided his scars made him either an object of fascination or an embarrassment to be managed. She stood there in her green silk, chin level, eyes steady, completely unbothered by the dozens of people still pretending not to watch them. "You don't know who I am," he said. "I know exactly who you are," she answered. "You're the Duke of Ellisford. And right now, you are also a man who fell down in front of people who don't deserve to see you struggle. That doesn't make you less of either." He wanted to hate her for saying it. Instead, he found himself studying her face, trying to place her among the endless parade of debutantes he'd been avoiding all season. She wasn't beautiful in the way the room prized, not dazzling, not dripping in jewels, but there was something unshakable about her, something that made the noise of the ballroom feel very far away. "Lady Beatrice Hartwell," she said before he could ask, "in case you were wondering whether to bother remembering my name." "I wasn't planning to," Julian lied. "Good," she said. "Then it won't disappoint you when I ask nothing further of you, Your Grace." She dipped the smallest, most unimpressed curtsy he had ever received, and walked away, leaving him standing there with his cane, his pride in ruins, and his mind entirely occupied by a woman who had refused, point blank, to look away. He watched her go. She didn't glance back once, didn't linger to see if he was staring, didn't perform the little backward look so many young ladies used to gauge a man's interest. She simply crossed the ballroom and rejoined a cluster of older women near the refreshment table, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all. Julian's aunt, Lady Margaret, appeared at his elbow within seconds, fans snapping open with the fury of a woman who had witnessed the entire scene from across the room. "Well," she said, "that was mortifying." "Thank you for your support," Julian muttered. "I don't mean your fall," Margaret said. "Men fall. Men recover. I mean that girl. Do you know who her family is? Apparently they're called Hartwell." "Ruined," Margaret said, the word landing like a slammed door. "Her father gambled away most of the estate before he died. The daughter has been propping up what's left through sheer will and very unfashionable frugality. She has no dowry worth mentioning, no connections worth cultivating, and absolutely no business speaking to a duke as though she were his equal." "She wasn't speaking as though we were equal," Julian said, surprising himself with how quickly he defended her. "She was speaking as though I were a person. It's a rarer experience than you'd think." Margaret studied him with the particular suspicion only an aunt who had raised him could manage. Don't let one clever sentence turn your head, Julian. Clever women are dangerous precisely because they know exactly which words will do that. He didn't answer her. His eyes had already drifted back across the ballroom, searching for pale green silk among the crowd, and he hated how quickly he found it, and how long he let himself look. For the rest of the evening, Julian kept his distance. He danced twice, out of obligation, with women whose names he forgot within the hour. He accepted congratulations on his recovery from the fall that he did not want, and endured jokes about his leg that were not funny. All the while, some part of his attention stayed fixed on the far side of the room, tracking a woman who never once looked his way again. It irritated him more than it should have. He was the Duke of Ellisford. Men bowed when he entered rooms. Mothers pushed their daughters toward him with the subtlety of cattle drivers. He was used to being watched, courted, angled for. He was not used to being ignored, and certainly not by a woman with a ruined estate and a sharp tongue who had knelt beside him on a ballroom floor without a trace of pity in her expression. When the carriage finally carried him home that night, his leg throbbing with every rut in the road, Julian found himself replaying her words instead of nursing his usual bitterness about the fall. I think it's cowardice dressed up as manners. No one had ever called him a coward, no one would dare, and yet she hadn't meant it as an insult to him alone. She'd meant it for the whole glittering room, for every lord and lady who'd turned their faces away rather than witness a man in pain. He thought of his men on the battlefield, the ones who hadn't looked away either, who had dragged him from beneath a fallen horse while cannon fire tore up the earth around them. He thought of how rare that kind of courage was, and how strange it was to find an echo of it in a ballroom, in silk, in a woman who owed him nothing and had chosen honesty anyway. By the time his carriage reached the gates of Ellisford House, Julian had decided two things. First, that he would find out everything he could about Lady Beatrice Hartwell. Second, that he would never, under any circumstances, admit to another living soul how much one blunt sentence from a stranger had unsettled him. He limped up the front steps without his cane, testing his leg against the pain out of sheer stubbornness, and did not fall. Inside, alone in his study, he poured a glass of brandy he didn't drink, and stared into the dying fire instead. His valet had already laid out his correspondence for the morning, stacks of invitations he intended to ignore, requests from tenants he intended to answer, a letter from his solicitor regarding an estate matter he had been putting off for weeks. None of it interested him tonight. Instead, his mind kept circling back to the moment her hand had appeared in front of his face, steady and unafraid, asking for nothing except that he take it. He had refused. He had been too proud, too wounded, too used to protecting himself from exactly that kind of kindness. He wondered, staring into the flames, what would have happened if he'd simply let her help him up. The next morning, Julian sent for his steward before he'd even finished dressing. "Hartwell," he said, without preamble. "The family with the estate near Camden Hollow. What do you know of them?" His steward, a careful man named Peter Ainsworth who had served the Ellisford household for over a decade, hesitated only briefly before answering. "The late Baron Hartwell left considerable debts, Your Grace. Gambling, mostly, though there are whispers of worse. His son has shown little interest in managing what remains. It's the daughter, Lady Beatrice, who has been keeping the household afloat, from what I understand, selling off what jewelry and land she can without drawing too much attention to the family's decline. And the estate itself? Struggling, Your Grace. I've heard the creditors are growing impatient. There's talk the property may go to auction within the year, perhaps sooner." Julian said nothing for a long moment, his fingers tapping against the edge of his desk. "Keep me informed," he said finally. Quietly. Ainsworth's expression flickered with the barest hint of curiosity, quickly smoothed away by years of discretion. "Of course, Your Grace." Julian dismissed him, and sat alone in the growing light of morning, telling himself this was simple curiosity, nothing more. A duke ought to know the state of families within his social circle. It meant nothing that his pulse had quickened at the mention of her name, or that he found himself already anticipating whatever news Ainsworth might bring next. He told himself a great many things that morning. He believed almost none of them. Because for the first time since he'd returned from war broken and half convinced the world would only ever see the parts of him that had failed, someone had looked directly at his weakness and refused to flinch. She hadn't offered comfort. She hadn't offered pity. She had simply offered her hand, plainly, without condition, and told him the truth when he tried to push her away. Julian Ashcombe, Duke of Ellisford, decorated for bravery he no longer felt, feared by rivals and courted by every ambitious family in London, sat alone in his study and admitted, silently, to no one but himself, that Lady Beatrice Hartwell had done something far more dangerous than help him off a ballroom floor. She had made him want to be seen again, and that terrified him far more than falling ever could. The letter arrived at Hartwell Grange on a morning cold enough to crack the frost on the windows, and it very nearly ended everything. Beatrice read it twice before she let herself believe the words on the page. Her family's remaining debts, the ones that had haunted every waking hour since her father's death, had been paid in full by an anonymous benefactor. The auction notice on their land, scheduled for the following month, had been withdrawn. There was no explanation, no signature, only a single line at the bottom of the page, written in a hand she did not recognize. Consider it settled. Her brother Edmund sprawled in the chair across from her with the particular carelessness of a man who had never once worried about where their next meal came from, barely looked up from his newspaper. "Someone's paid our debts," Beatrice said, her voice unsteady. "All of them." "Splendid," Edmund said. "Then perhaps we can finally replace the carriage." "Edmund, this isn't a joke. Someone has settled everything, and we don't know who, or why, or what they might want in return." That last part frightened her more than the debt itself ever had. She had spent 2 years learning exactly how the world treated a young woman with a failing estate and a family name worth less than the paper it was written on. Men did not offer that kind of money without expecting something. She had seen enough predatory smiles at enough dwindling dinner parties to know precisely what men expected from desperate women. She folded the letter carefully and tucked it into her writing desk, determined to find out exactly who had sent it before she allowed herself a single moment of relief. It did not take her long to have her suspicions. 3 days after the letter arrived, a crate of medical supplies was delivered to the small clinic Beatrice ran out of the old gatehouse for wounded soldiers returning from the war, men the army had discarded once they were no longer useful on a battlefield. The crate bore no note, but the seal pressed into the wax was unmistakable. She had seen that same crest on a signet ring on the hand of a man she had knelt beside on a ballroom floor 2 weeks earlier. The Duke of Ellisford. Beatrice sat very still for a long moment, staring at that crest, feeling something complicated twist in her chest. Gratitude, certainly, but underneath it, something sharper. Suspicion, pride, and, though she refused to examine it too closely, something that felt uncomfortably like hope. She had told him the truth in that ballroom because it needed saying, not because she wanted anything from him. She had walked away without a backward glance because she genuinely believed that would be the end of it. One strange encounter between a duke and a woman he would forget within the week. Instead, he had quietly, deliberately, saved her family from ruin. She decided, sitting there with the crate of bandages and tonics in front of her, that she would not simply accept his charity in silence. Whatever his reasons, she intended to look him in the eye and ask for them directly. The opportunity arrived sooner than she expected. A charity gala, hosted by the Duke of Ellisford himself, was announced within the week. A fundraiser for wounded veterans held at his own townhouse. Every paper in London carried the notice. Beatrice suspected, reading it over her morning tea, that the timing was no accident at all. She attended without an invitation, using her clinic work as justification, and found the grand hall of Ellisford House transformed for the occasion, filled with silver trays and hired musicians, and the particular brand of performative generosity the Ton loved to display. She searched the crowd until she found him, standing near the far end of the room in a dark blue coat, looking every bit as uncomfortable in his own home as he had looked on the ballroom floor 2 weeks before. "Your Grace," she said, approaching without waiting to be announced. Julian turned, and for a brief, unguarded moment, something flickered across his face that looked almost like relief. It vanished quickly, replaced by the composed distance he clearly wore like armor. "Lady Beatrice, I wasn't aware you'd been invited." "I wasn't," she said. "I came anyway. I find it's a habit of mine, going where I'm not strictly invited when the matter concerns my family." His jaw tightened slightly. "I don't follow. Don't you?" She held up the letter she'd carried folded in her reticule for exactly this purpose, along with a swatch of fabric torn from the crate's packing, still bearing the wax seal. "This crest was pressed into wax on a delivery of medical supplies to my clinic, the same crest I've seen on a ring, Your Grace, on your hand, specifically." For a long moment, Julian said nothing. Around them, the party continued, oblivious, laughter and music rising and falling like tide against rocks neither of them noticed. "I don't know what you're referring to," he said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. "You're a terrible liar," Beatrice said. "For a man so skilled at commanding a room, I'd have expected better." Something shifted in his expression, the faintest crack in the composed mask he wore so carefully. "Fine. Yes, it was me. Why? Because you helped me when you had no reason to, he said, quieter now, the words coming reluctantly, as though each one cost him something. Because you told me the truth when everyone else in that room was busy pretending nothing had happened. I don't tolerate debts, Lady Beatrice. Not the kind owed in coin, and not the kind owed in kindness. So this was repayment, Beatrice said slowly. Nothing more. What else would it be? She studied him for a long moment, searching his face for the answer he clearly wasn't ready to give, not even to himself. I don't need your money to feel whole, Your Grace. My family's circumstances are not a debt for you to settle because your pride couldn't bear owing me a kindness. Then what would you have me do? His voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through the careful control. Ignore it? Watch your family lose everything while I do nothing, simply because accepting my help offends your pride? There's a difference, Beatrice said, between help and control. I don't yet know which this is. He looked, for a moment, genuinely wounded by the accusation, and Beatrice felt an unexpected pang of guilt for delivering it so bluntly. But she had learned, over 2 years of fending off men who wanted to manage her family's ruin for their own benefit, that bluntness was the only language that kept her safe. I want nothing from you, Julian said finally, each word deliberate. No arrangement, no expectation, no claim on your gratitude. If it eases your conscience, consider the debt paid and the matter closed. I only ask one thing in return. And what is that? That you stay, he said, gesturing vaguely at the gala around them, the soldiers scattered among the crowd in their formal but ill-fitting borrowed coats, the awkward mingling of aristocrats and the men they'd sent to war and largely forgotten. I organized this event because I felt I ought to. I find I have very little idea how to actually run it. You clearly know these men, their needs, their circumstances, far better than I do. Beatrice glanced around the room properly for the first time, noticing details she'd missed in her determination to confront him. A young soldier standing alone near the wall, his empty sleeve pinned neatly at the shoulder, clearly unsure whether he belonged among the silk and silver of the aristocracy that had sent him to fight. An older man in the corner, flinching every time a tray of glasses clattered too loudly, the sound too close to gunfire for his nerves to easily forgive. You built this event and didn't think to ask any of them what they actually needed, she said, not unkindly, simply stating what was obvious to her. I built this event because I didn't know what else to do with the guilt, Julian admitted, the honesty surprising them both. I came home from that war with a title, a fortune, and legs that mostly still work. Half the men I served beside came home with far less, or didn't come home at all. Throwing money at the problem felt like the only thing within my power. Beatrice looked at him then, really looked, past the polished coat and the ducal bearing, and saw underneath it something raw, a man genuinely trying and genuinely failing to know how to help, hiding that uncertainty behind wealth because wealth was the only tool he trusted himself to wield properly. Then let me help you use it correctly, she said. Something in his shoulders eased, the tension he'd been carrying since she first approached him, loosening into something that looked, for just a moment, like gratitude. For the rest of the evening, Beatrice moved through the gala at his side, quietly redirecting conversations, introducing him to the men whose names he hadn't bothered to learn, explaining which of them needed practical assistance and which simply needed to be treated like men again, rather than charity cases to be paraded for the ton's approval. Julian listened, he asked questions, he remembered names. By the end of the night, standing together near the doors as the last guests filtered out into the cold, Beatrice found herself studying him with a curiosity she hadn't expected to feel. You're not at all what the papers make you out to be, she said. And what do the papers make me out to be? Cold, distant, a man who cares for nothing beyond his title and his own comfort. Julian's mouth curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but came close. And what do you make me out to be, Lady Beatrice? She considered the question honestly before answering, unwilling to offer flattery simply because the moment seemed to call for it. I think you're a man who's spent so long being watched for weakness that you've forgotten what it feels like to simply be watched for who you are. Julian went very still. Whatever he might have said in response was interrupted by his aunt's voice cutting sharply across the emptying hall, summoning him toward some final social obligation neither of them could avoid. He excused himself with visible reluctance, glancing back at Beatrice once before he disappeared into the crowd, as though checking whether she'd already looked away. She hadn't. Walking home that night through streets slick with early winter rain, Beatrice turned the evening over in her mind, examining it from every angle the way she examined a ledger for hidden errors. She had come to Ellisford House intending to confront a man about an unwanted debt. She left it uncertain whether the debt between them had ever truly been about money at all. She told herself, quite firmly, that whatever she'd felt standing beside him at that gala meant nothing. He was a duke. She was a woman with a barely solvent estate and a brother more interested in newspapers than responsibility. Whatever gratitude or curiosity had passed between them tonight would fade quickly once the practical matter of the charity event concluded. She told herself this several times over the following days. She did not, entirely, manage to believe it. The Gatehouse Clinic was nearly out of bandages when Julian Ashcombe arrived unannounced, and Beatrice nearly dropped the tray she was carrying at the sight of him standing in her doorway, dressed plainly, without his usual retinue of servants trailing behind. "You could have sent word," she said, setting the tray down carefully before her hands betrayed how startled she was. "I did," Julian said. "You didn't answer. I've had 11 men through this clinic since dawn, Your Grace. Correspondence has not been a priority." He glanced past her into the small, crowded room, taking in the cots lined against the walls, the makeshift shelves stocked with what little medicine she could afford, the exhausted faces of soldiers who'd been fighting a war most of London preferred to forget existed. Something in his expression shifted, the polished composure cracking just slightly at the edges. "I want to help," he said, properly, not simply throwing coin at the problem and calling it charity. Beatrice studied him for a long moment. In the weeks since the gala, they had crossed paths more often than either of them had planned, Julian appearing at the clinic with supplies, Beatrice attending events he hosted for wounded veterans, the two of them slowly building something that neither had a proper name for yet. She had stopped questioning his motives somewhere along the way, though she hadn't quite admitted that to herself. "Then roll up your sleeves," she said, "because Corporal Whitfield's bandage needs changing, and I'd rather not do it alone." To her genuine surprise, he did exactly that. The following hours passed in a blur of practical work neither of them had expected to share. Julian, it turned out, had learned more about wound care during the war than most of the ton would ever guess, his hands steady and sure as he helped change dressings and steady trembling men through the pain of it. Beatrice watched him work beside her, saw the way the soldiers' guarded expressions eased slightly when they realized the Duke wasn't simply performing charity for an audience, that he understood exactly what they'd endured because he'd endured it himself. "You never talk about it," she said quietly, during a rare lull, as they sat together on the clinic's back step in the fading afternoon light. "The war. What happened to your leg?" Julian was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the gray winter garden beyond the gatehouse. "I don't talk about it because talking about it means remembering it properly, and I've spent 3 years trying very hard not to." "You don't have to tell me," Beatrice said. "I only meant that you don't have to carry it alone, if you ever wanted otherwise." He looked at her then, something raw and unguarded crossing his features. "We were pinned near a ridge outside a village whose name I've deliberately forgotten. My horse went down under cannon fire, and I went down with it. I remember the weight of the animal on my leg, the sound it made, the certainty that I was going to die there in the mud with no one to know or care. 2 of my men dragged me clear under fire that should have killed all 3 of us. One of them didn't survive the week." Beatrice said nothing, letting the silence hold space for what he'd offered her. "I came home a duke," Julian continued, voice low, "with a title I never wanted, and a leg that reminds me every single day of a debt I can never properly repay. So I throw money at soldiers and organize galas and tell myself it's enough, because the alternative is admitting that no amount of coin will ever undo what happened to the men who didn't come home." "It won't," Beatrice agreed gently. "But it isn't supposed to undo anything, Julian. It's supposed to help the men who did come home find their footing again. That matters, even if it isn't everything." It was the first time she'd used his given name, he noticed. So did she, the words settling between them with a weight that made her cheeks warm despite the cold evening air. "I have a secret too," she said, partly to fill the sudden silence, partly because his honesty had loosened something in her chest that wanted matching honesty in return. "One I've never told anyone outside my own household." "You don't have to tell me either," Julian said, echoing her own words back to her with a faint, warm smile. "I want to," Beatrice said. "My father didn't lose our fortune entirely on his own gambling, though that's the story everyone believes. My brother Edmund incurred debts of his own, considerable ones, and rather than see him ruined publicly, my father covered them quietly, again and again, until there was nothing left to cover anything with. Edmund doesn't know that I know. He believes our father's failures were entirely his own doing, and I've let him believe it, because the truth would destroy what little relationship we have left." "That's a heavy thing to carry alone," Julian said. So is a war you can't stop reliving, Beatrice answered. They sat together in the quiet for a long while after that, the kind of silence that didn't need filling. Two people who had each handed the other something fragile and trusted it wouldn't be broken. When Julian finally rose to leave, he offered his hand to help her up from the step, and this time, Beatrice took it without hesitation. Their fingers stayed linked a moment longer than necessary. Beatrice, he said, her name unfamiliar and careful in his mouth, as though he were testing whether he'd earned the right to use it. Yes? He didn't answer with words. Instead, he leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to step back if she wished, and Beatrice found she had absolutely no desire to do so. The space between them narrowed to almost nothing, his hand still holding hers, his eyes searching her face for permission she was more than willing to give. Julian. His aunt's voice cracked across the garden like a whip, sharp and furious, and both of them stepped back so quickly that Beatrice nearly stumbled over the step behind her. Lady Margaret stood at the edge of the garden path, her expression a carefully composed mask of icy displeasure, though her eyes betrayed exactly how much she had witnessed. "Aunt Margaret," Julian said, recovering his composure with visible effort, "I wasn't expecting you." "Clearly," Margaret said, her gaze flicking pointedly between him and Beatrice. "A word, Julian. Now." He glanced back at Beatrice, an unspoken apology in his expression, before following his aunt a short distance away, though not nearly far enough for Beatrice to avoid hearing every word of the conversation that followed. "Have you lost your mind entirely?" Margaret's voice was low but furious. "A duke does not court a penniless nobody with a ruined family name. Julian, you have obligations. To your title, to your estate, to the family name you've spent 3 years rebuilding after your father very nearly ran it into the ground before you." "I am not courting anyone," Julian said, though the denial sounded weak even to Beatrice's ears. "You were about to kiss her in a gatehouse garden," Margaret snapped. "Do not insult my intelligence by pretending otherwise. Whatever this is, end it now, before it becomes something the entire ton is whispering about. She has nothing to offer you, Julian. No dowry, no connections, nothing but a failing estate and a brother drowning in debts of his own making. You cannot afford this kind of scandal, not after everything you've worked to rebuild." Beatrice stood frozen near the step, every word landing like a slap, though she suspected Margaret intended her to hear exactly this. She had known, of course, that a duke and a woman in her circumstances could never be an easy match in the eyes of society. Hearing it stated so plainly, so cruelly, was different from simply knowing it in the abstract. Julian's response was too quiet for Beatrice to catch, and whatever he said didn't seem to satisfy his aunt, who swept away down the garden path a few moments later with the particular fury of a woman certain she would ultimately win this argument regardless of her nephew's protests. Julian returned to Beatrice slowly, his expression carefully composed, though she could see the effort it cost him. "I apologize for that," he said. "You don't need to apologize for your aunt's opinions," Beatrice said, though her voice came out steadier than she felt. "She isn't entirely wrong, Julian. I have nothing to offer a man in your position. No dowry, no useful connections, a family name that's more liability than asset. That isn't what I want from you," Julian said, stepping closer again, his voice low and certain. "I have never once thought of you in terms of what you could offer me, Beatrice. I think of you in terms of what you've already given me, which is more honesty in a handful of weeks than I've received from anyone else in 3 years." "That's a lovely sentiment," Beatrice said. "But sentiment doesn't silence gossip, and gossip doesn't repair estates or restore family names. I won't be the reason you lose everything you've rebuilt, and I won't let my aunt's fear of scandal decide who I'm permitted to care for," Julian said firmly. Beatrice wanted, desperately, to believe him, but she had learned early and hard how quickly good intentions crumbled under the weight of society's judgment, how easily even the most sincere affection could be worn down by relentless disapproval. She stepped back, putting careful distance between them, though it cost her more than she let show. "I think you should go," she said quietly, "before your aunt says something to the wrong person, and this becomes a story neither of us can control." Julian looked as though he wanted to argue, but something in her expression must have convinced him it wasn't the moment for it. He nodded once, retrieved his coat, and paused at the garden gate before leaving. "This isn't finished, Beatrice," he said. "Whatever my aunt believes, whatever society decides to whisper, this isn't finished." She watched him disappear down the lane toward his waiting carriage, and only once he was fully out of sight did she allow herself to sink onto the garden step, her earlier certainty dissolving into something far more uncertain and far more frightening than any debt or ruined estate had ever made her feel. Because she had spent 2 years building walls sturdy enough to survive her family's collapse without breaking, and in the space of a few short weeks, a duke with a wounded leg and an honest heart had found his way past every single one of them. The rumor reached Beatrice before breakfast, carried into Hartwell Grange by her aunt's cousin, a woman who collected gossip the way other people collected porcelain, with obvious pride and no particular discretion. "They're saying you trapped him," the woman announced, settling herself into the drawing room without invitation, her eyes bright with the particular excitement of someone delivering scandal rather than comfort. "That you engineered the whole business at the ball, the fall, the rescue, all of it, to snare a duke desperate enough for sympathy to fall for the first woman clever enough to offer it." "That's absurd," Beatrice said, setting down her teacup carefully to keep her hands from shaking. "I did nothing but help a man who'd fallen. Anyone would have done the same." "Anyone didn't," the cousin said. "You did, and now half of London is saying you've spent the season maneuvering your way into his household, first with your little clinic charity, then with private meetings in Gatehouse Gardens where you were seen, Beatrice, practically in his arms." Beatrice's stomach dropped. Someone had seen. Someone had watched that almost kiss in the garden, and turned it into exactly the kind of scandal Lady Margaret had warned would destroy everything Julian had worked to rebuild. "Who's saying this?" Beatrice asked, though she suspected she already knew. "Lady Corwin, mostly," the cousin admitted, though she's hardly alone in repeating it. "She's made no secret of her own hopes regarding the Duke, and I dare say she's rather furious to find a penniless nobody has captured his attention instead." Beatrice had encountered Lady Corwin only twice, both times at events hosted by Julian, and both times she'd noted the woman's calculating smile and the way her gaze lingered too long on Julian's title, rather than the man himself. She had thought little of it then. She thought considerably more of it now. By the time Beatrice ventured into town that afternoon for supplies the clinic desperately needed, the whispers had already outpaced her, following her down the street in the form of sidelong glances and conversations that stopped abruptly whenever she drew close. A shopkeeper who had always greeted her warmly suddenly found urgent business in the back room. Two young ladies she'd once considered friendly acquaintances crossed the street rather than pass her directly. It was, Beatrice realized with growing dread, exactly what Lady Margaret had predicted. And it was happening precisely because she had allowed herself, against every hard lesson 2 years of ruin had taught her, to hope that a duke's regard might survive contact with the wider world. She returned to Hartwell Grange that evening exhausted and hollowed out, only to find her brother Edmund waiting in the drawing room, newspaper in hand, his expression unusually serious. "You need to see this," he said, holding out the paper. The gossip column occupied barely a quarter page, but its contents landed like a physical blow. It named her directly, described her as an ambitious young woman who had engineered her way into the Duke of Ellisford's affections, through calculated displays of charity and manufactured intimacy, and suggested, none too subtly, that her family's history of financial ruin made her motives entirely transparent to anyone paying proper attention. "This is ridiculous," Edmund said, though his voice carried less conviction than Beatrice would have liked. "You've never manipulated anyone in your life, Beatrice. You're the least calculating person I know." "It doesn't matter whether it's true," Beatrice said quietly. "It only matters whether people believe it, and people believe exactly what confirms what they already suspect about families like ours." She sat with the paper long after Edmund had retreated to his own concerns, reading and rereading the cruel, elegant phrases until they blurred together into a single, unbearable truth. Whatever had been growing between her and Julian, whatever honest, careful thing had built itself in stolen conversations and shared secrets, it had never stood a chance against a world determined to see her as nothing more than a fortune hunter dressed up in charitable intentions. She made her decision that night, though it cost her more than she let herself acknowledge. She would withdraw, quietly, completely, before the scandal grew large enough to damage Julian's standing beyond repair. She would stop attending his charity events, stop accepting his supplies for the clinic, stop allowing herself the dangerous luxury of his company. It was the only way to protect him from the consequences of caring for someone society had already decided didn't deserve his attention. The following weeks tested her resolve more thoroughly than she'd anticipated. Julian sent letters, first polite and inquiring, then increasingly concerned as her replies grew shorter and more distant. He appeared twice at the clinic, both times finding her conveniently occupied elsewhere, a small deception that cost her more than she cared to admit each time she watched his carriage depart from her window. He sent supplies she couldn't afford to refuse, though she made certain never to thank him in person. corresponding instead through careful, formal notes that gave away nothing of what the distance was actually costing her. Julian, for his part, misread her withdrawal precisely as Beatrice had feared he might. He heard the same rumors circulating through London, the same cruel speculation about her motives, and rather than dismissing them outright, some traitorous corner of his mind began to wonder whether her sudden coldness confirmed rather than contradicted the gossip. Perhaps, he thought during his darker moments, she had realized her scheme was unraveling and had retreated before the scandal could implicate her too thoroughly. Perhaps the honesty he'd believed in so completely had simply been a more sophisticated performance than he'd given her credit for. He hated himself for the thought almost as soon as it formed, but doubt, once planted, proved difficult to fully uproot, particularly when the person who might have reassured him had gone silent precisely when he needed her most. It was Lady Margaret, of all people, who finally forced the truth into the open. She found Julian in his study late one evening, staring at an unanswered letter he'd begun 3 times and abandoned each attempt, and something in his expression must have finally pierced through her earlier disapproval. "You look wretched," she observed, settling into the chair across from his desk without invitation. "I'm perfectly well," Julian said, in the tone of a man who was very clearly not. "You've been perfectly well and perfectly miserable for 3 weeks now," Margaret said. "Ever since Lady Beatrice stopped answering your letters properly. I assume the two facts are connected." "She made her position clear enough," Julian said, bitterness creeping into his voice despite his effort to sound indifferent. "Whatever I believed was growing between us, it seems I misjudged the depth of her sincerity." Margaret was quiet for a long moment, studying her nephew with an expression that had softened considerably from the fury she'd displayed in the gatehouse garden weeks earlier. "I need to tell you something," she said finally, "and I suspect you won't thank me for it, though you should." "What is it?" "The rumors about Lady Beatrice trapping you," Margaret said. "I know their origin. Lady Corwin approached me directly, weeks ago, seeking my support in discouraging your attention toward Lady Beatrice. When I declined to interfere, she made it quite clear she intended to discourage the match through other means. I didn't take the threat seriously at the time. I regret that now." Julian went very still. "You're saying Lady Corwin started the rumors?" "I'm saying I have no proof beyond her own thinly veiled threats," Margaret said. "But I would wager considerably on it, yes. And I'd wager further that Lady Beatrice's withdrawal has considerably less to do with any change of heart on her part, and considerably more to do with protecting you from exactly the scandal I once warned you about myself." Julian's hands closed into fists on the surface of his desk. "You told me to end things with her." "I did," Margaret admitted, "and I was wrong to do so without considering what she might sacrifice to spare you the consequences I feared. I've watched you these past weeks, Julian, and I've come to understand something I should have recognized far sooner. That girl makes you more yourself than I've seen you be since before the war. I was so concerned with protecting the family name that I nearly cost you the one thing worth protecting it for." Julian sat in stunned silence, turning the revelation over in his mind. Weeks of misplaced doubt and quiet misery reorganizing themselves around this single devastating possibility. Beatrice hadn't withdrawn because the rumors were true. She had withdrawn because she believed, with the same stubborn selflessness that had made her refuse to look away from him on that ballroom floor, that his reputation mattered more than her own happiness. He stood so abruptly that his chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I need to see her," he said. "Julian, it's nearly midnight." "I don't particularly care," he said, already reaching for his coat, 3 weeks of doubt burning away into something far more urgent and far more certain than he'd felt in longer than he could remember. Margaret watched him go with an expression that mingled worry and something close to pride, and said nothing further to stop him. Beatrice woke to the sound of gravel striking her bedroom window, and nearly fell out of bed reaching for the fire poker before she recognized the shape standing in the moonlit garden below. "Julian." She threw open the window, heart hammering, half convinced she was still dreaming. "What on earth are you doing? It's the middle of the night. Someone will see you." "Let them see," Julian called up, not troubling to lower his voice, though a lamp flickered on in a neighboring window at the sound of him. "I've spent 3 weeks caring far too much what people see and say, Beatrice, and I find I'm finished with it. You'll wake the entire household. Then come down and stop me before I wake the entire street," he said, and something in his voice, steady and unwilling to be denied, sent Beatrice scrambling for a shawl before she'd fully decided to comply. She found him in the garden minutes later, moonlight catching the sharp lines of his face, his expression fierce in a way she'd never seen from him before. not even in the ballroom when his pride had been at its most wounded. "You need to leave," she whispered urgently. "If anyone sees you here at this hour, the rumors will only worsen." "I know exactly why the rumors started," Julian said. "Lady Corwin, my aunt confirmed it tonight. She approached my aunt weeks ago, threatening precisely this sort of campaign if I continued pursuing you. And rather than warning me, rather than telling me the truth, you decided to simply disappear and let me believe whatever I wanted about your silence." Beatrice flinched at the accuracy of it. "I didn't disappear to punish you, Julian. I disappeared because I love you, and I couldn't bear to be the reason you lost everything you've spent 3 years rebuilding." The word love hung between them in the cold night air, spoken before either of them had quite intended it, and Beatrice felt her face flush despite the chill. "You love me," Julian said quietly, something breaking open in his expression. "And your solution was to vanish from my life entirely, rather than tell me so. What good would telling you have done?" Beatrice's voice cracked slightly, weeks of carefully controlled misery finally breaking through. "Your aunt was right, Julian. I have nothing to offer you. No dowry, no connections. A family name already halfway to ruin before Lady Corwin ever opened her mouth. Loving you doesn't change any of that. It only makes the impossibility of it hurt more." "Do you truly believe," Julian said, closing the distance between them until barely a foot separated them, "that I care one particle for dowries or connections? I have more fortune than I could spend in 3 lifetimes, Beatrice. What I don't have, what I haven't had since before the war, is a single person in my life who looks at me and sees a man rather than a title, a scar, or a purse to be emptied." "Julian, let me finish," he said, and something in his tone made her fall silent. "I have spent 3 weeks convincing myself that your silence meant the rumors were true, that everything between us had been some elaborate calculation on your part. I am ashamed of how easily I believed it, ashamed that I let doubt take root simply because you stopped writing letters. But I understand now why you did it, and I understand that it came from the same stubborn courage that made you refuse to look away from me on that ballroom floor. You were trying to protect me, even at the cost of your own happiness." Beatrice felt tears gathering, hot and unwelcome, and pressed her hand against her mouth to keep from making a sound that might wake the household further. "It was never going to work," she whispered. "A duke, and a ruined baron's daughter. Society would never." "I don't particularly care what society decides to accept," Julian interrupted, gently but firmly. "I have spent my entire life since the war believing my worth was measured by how well I concealed my weaknesses, how thoroughly I performed the role expected of me. You are the only person who ever looked at my worst moment and told me the truth instead of offering comfortable lies. I refuse to let Lady Corwin's jealousy, or my aunt's fear of scandal, or your own stubborn selflessness convince either of us that we don't deserve to choose each other simply because it would be easier not to." "It isn't that simple," Beatrice said, though her voice had lost most of its earlier conviction. "It is exactly that simple," Julian said. "I love you, Beatrice Hartwell. Not despite your circumstances, not because helping you eases some guilt I carry from the war, but because you are the most honest, most courageous person I have ever known, and I am tired, so profoundly tired, of pretending I don't want to spend the rest of my life learning every remaining thing there is to know about you." The garden was silent except for the distant call of a night bird and the sound of Beatrice's own unsteady breathing. She looked at him, standing there in the moonlight, having climbed out of his carriage and thrown gravel at her window like some reckless boy rather than a duke, having said the word love without hesitation or calculation, and felt the last of her careful resistance crumbling. "This will cause a scandal," she said, though it was no longer a protest, merely an acknowledgement of the difficulty ahead. "Then we'll weather it together," Julian said. "I would rather face every whisper in London standing beside you than spend one more day pretending indifference I don't actually feel." Before Beatrice could respond, a light flared to life in an upstairs window of Hartwell Grange, followed almost immediately by her brother Edmund's voice calling out in alarm, clearly having woken to strange noises in the garden and assumed the worst. "Beatrice? Is someone out there?" "It's the Duke of Ellisford, Edmund," Beatrice called back, a laugh bubbling up unexpectedly through the tears still gathered in her eyes, the absurdity of the entire midnight scene finally catching up with her. He climbed through the garden to declare his affections. There was a long pause from the upstairs window, followed by Edmund's voice, considerably more awake now and tinged with disbelief. "At this hour? Has the man lost his mind entirely?" "Rather thoroughly, I believe," Julian called up, not remotely embarrassed, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. Edmund's head disappeared from the window, muttering something about fetching a proper light rather than allowing his sister to conduct clandestine garden conversations in near total darkness, and Beatrice found herself laughing properly now, the tension of the past weeks finally breaking loose into something lighter and freer than she'd felt since the rumors first began. "You're impossible," she told Julian, still smiling despite herself. "I've been called worse," Julian said, reaching for her hand and finding it readily offered this time. No hesitation, no careful distance between them. "Though I confess I've never particularly minded impossible things. My grandmother's cane once told me impossible was simply a word people used to describe things they hadn't yet worked hard enough for. That's a strange thing for a cane to say." "It was a strange cane," Julian said solemnly, and Beatrice laughed again, the sound carrying warm and unguarded through the cold garden air. They stood together for a long while after that, hands linked, the earlier fear and doubt gradually dissolving into something steadier and more certain than either of them had allowed themselves to hope for during the difficult weeks apart. Beatrice knew the coming days would not be easy. Lady Corwin's rumors would not simply vanish because a duke had climbed through a garden at midnight, and society's judgment would likely follow them for months, perhaps longer, before the scandal finally lost its appetite for their story. But standing there in the moonlight with Julian's hand steady around hers, she found she no longer feared it the way she had 3 weeks earlier. "I won't hide this time," she told him. "Whatever comes next, whatever people say, I won't disappear again to spare either of us the difficulty of it." "Good," Julian said, "because I intend to make this considerably more official than a midnight garden confession, and I would very much prefer you remain present for the entire ordeal. Is that a proposal, Your Grace?" "Not yet," Julian said, a genuine smile breaking across his face, the first she'd seen from him in weeks, that reached fully into his eyes. "When I ask you properly, Beatrice Hartwell, it will not be shouted through a garden window at midnight with your brother eavesdropping from the staircase." "I heard that," Edmund's voice called from somewhere inside the house, and Beatrice laughed again, bright and unguarded, the sound carrying out into the dark London night like the first genuine warmth she'd allowed herself in far too long. Julian left before dawn, though not before promising to return properly, in daylight, with considerably less scandal attached to the visit. Beatrice watched his carriage disappear down the lane, and climbed back into her own bed exhausted, uncertain, and for the first time in 3 difficult weeks, entirely and completely hopeful. Whatever came next, she would not face it alone, and she would not look away from it either. Lady Corwin arrived at the Ellisford charity gala wearing crimson silk and the confident smile of a woman certain she had already won, and she very nearly ruined everything before the evening properly began. "Your Grace," she said, intercepting Julian near the entrance before Beatrice had even removed her cloak, her voice pitched, deliberately loud enough to carry to the gathering crowd of guests. "How brave of you to continue associating with Lady Beatrice, given everything that's being said. Though I suppose a man of your generosity can't help extending charity even where it's clearly unwanted by decent society." Several nearby guests turned to listen, the particular hush of anticipated scandal falling over that corner of the ballroom. Beatrice felt her stomach tighten, old instincts urging her to retreat, to smooth things over, to disappear quietly rather than provide fuel for further gossip. She didn't move. "Lady Corwin," Julian said, his voice carrying the same easy command Beatrice had first noticed the night he refused her help off the ballroom floor, though there was nothing defensive in it now, only calm certainty. "I understand you've taken considerable interest in my personal affairs these past weeks. I'm curious what prompted such dedication to a matter that doesn't concern you." Lady Corwin's smile faltered slightly. "I simply thought you deserved to know what's being said, Your Grace. As a friend." "A friend," Julian repeated, "who approached my aunt weeks ago threatening a campaign of gossip if I continued my association with Lady Beatrice. I find that a curious definition of friendship." The hush around them deepened considerably, guests exchanging glances, the direction of the evening's gossip visibly shifting in real time. Lady Corwin's composure cracked further, color rising in her cheeks. "I don't know what you've been told, Your Grace, but I assure you." "You needn't assure me of anything," Julian said, not unkindly, though there was steel beneath the calm delivery. "I only wanted to be certain, in front of enough witnesses, that whatever continues to circulate regarding Lady Beatrice's character can be traced back to its proper source, should anyone care to investigate further." Lady Corwin retreated shortly after, her composure in ruins, and the whispered conversation that followed her through the ballroom carried a considerably different tone than the rumors that had plagued Beatrice for the past month. Beatrice watched the shift with something close to disbelief. Years of learned caution warring with the plain evidence in front of her that Julian had, without hesitation, defended her publicly and completely. "You didn't have to do that," she murmured, once they'd found a quieter corner of the room. "I've spent 3 weeks regretting every moment I didn't do exactly that," Julian said. "I don't intend to make the same mistake twice." The evening progressed considerably more smoothly after Lady Corwin's retreat, though Beatrice noticed the careful, curious glances that continued to follow them through the ballroom, the Tun clearly recalibrating its opinion of the match in real time. She found she minded it considerably less than she'd expected, standing beside Julian as he moved through the crowd, with the same easy confidence he'd shown facing down Lady Corwin, introducing her properly this time, without hesitation or qualification, simply as Lady Beatrice Hartwell. Near the end of the evening, Julian led her out onto the terrace, away from the noise and heat of the crowded ballroom, the cold night air a welcome relief after hours of careful public performance. "I told you I intended to do this properly," he said, once they were alone, his voice carrying a nervousness she'd never heard from him before, not even in the depths of his darkest confessions about the war. "Do what properly?" Beatrice asked, though something in his expression already told her precisely what was coming. Julian reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box, his hands, she noticed with quiet astonishment, actually trembling slightly as he opened it to reveal a modest ring, elegant rather than ostentatious, clearly chosen with considerable thought rather than simply purchased for show. "Beatrice Hartwell," he said, "you knelt beside me on a ballroom floor when every other person in that room chose to look away. You've spent every day since refusing to let me hide from either my weaknesses or my responsibilities, and you've done it without asking for a single thing in return, even when protecting me cost you your own peace and reputation. I don't want a wife who looks away from difficult truths, and I don't want a marriage built on anything less than the honesty you've shown me from the very first moment we met. Will you marry me?" Beatrice felt tears gathering for the second time in a month, though these carried none of the fear or grief of the last occasion, only overwhelming, uncomplicated joy. "Yes," she said, the word coming easily, certainly, without a trace of the hesitation that had haunted her for weeks. "Yes, Julian, I'll marry you." He slid the ring onto her finger with hands that had finally steadied, and when he kissed her properly for the first time, there on the terrace with the lights of the ballroom glowing warm behind them, Beatrice felt every fear of the past month, every whispered rumor, and every careful calculation about dowries and connections, finally dissolve into something far simpler and far more certain than any of it had ever been. They returned to the ballroom a short while later, and if Julian's arm remained rather deliberately around Beatrice's waist, and if the ring on her finger caught the candlelight rather noticeably as they moved through the crowd, neither of them troubled to hide it. Word spread through the gathering with the particular speed reserved for genuinely delicious gossip, and this time, Beatrice found she didn't mind the attention at all. Lady Margaret found them near the refreshment table, her expression carrying none of the earlier disapproval, replaced instead by something that looked remarkably like pride. "I owe you an apology," she said to Beatrice without preamble. "I was wrong about you, and I was wrong to let my fear of scandal nearly cost my nephew the one person who's made him truly himself again since before the war." "Thank you," Beatrice said, genuinely touched. "Though I understand why you were cautious. You were only trying to protect him." "I was trying to protect an idea of him," Margaret corrected gently. "You've shown me the actual man underneath it, and I find I much prefer him." She glanced toward Julian, who was currently being congratulated rather enthusiastically by a cluster of soldiers from the clinic, his laugh carrying warm and unguarded across the ballroom. "Welcome to the family, Lady Beatrice. I suspect you'll need every bit of that stubbornness of yours in the years ahead." "I intend to keep it close," Beatrice said, smiling. Later, as the gala finally began winding down and guests filtered slowly toward their waiting carriages, Julian found Beatrice standing near the same staircase where their story had begun weeks earlier, her fingers absently touching the ring on her hand. "Second thoughts?" he asked, coming to stand beside her. "Never," Beatrice said. "I was only thinking about that night. How certain I was that I'd simply helped a stranger off the floor and that would be the entire story. I was equally certain I'd never see you again after you walked away without a backward glance," Julian admitted. "I spent that entire carriage ride home furious that a single sentence from a woman I'd just met had unsettled me so thoroughly." "And now?" "Now," Julian said, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles just above the ring. "I intend to spend considerably more carriage rides thoroughly unsettled by you, for as many years as you'll have me." Beatrice laughed, the sound warm and free, and together they descended the staircase where a duke had once fallen in front of an entire ballroom, this time walking steadily side by side, neither of them looking away from the other, nor from whatever came next. The wedding took place at Ellisford House on a bright morning in early spring, though it very nearly didn't happen on schedule at all, thanks to a last-minute crisis involving Edmund Hartwell, a borrowed carriage horse, and a genuinely spectacular amount of mud. Beatrice was still laughing about it as she stood in the small antechamber off the main hall, smoothing the skirts of a gown considerably finer than anything she'd worn in the 2 lean years since her father's death, when her brother finally arrived, breathless and only partially cleaned up from his misadventure. "You look ridiculous," Beatrice told him, though her voice was fond rather than critical. "I look like a man who wrestled a horse out of a ditch to make his sister's wedding on time," Edmund corrected, straightening his still slightly damp coat with as much dignity as he could manage. "You're welcome, by the way." "Thank you," Beatrice said, and meant it, thinking of how far they'd come since the days when Edmund had barely looked up from his newspaper to acknowledge the family's crumbling finances. Something had shifted in him since the debts were settled, a gradual awakening to responsibility that Beatrice suspected owed something to watching his sister refuse to let circumstance define her. The ceremony itself passed in a warm blur that Beatrice would spend years trying, imperfectly, to fully recall. Julian's voice steady and certain as he spoke his vows, Lady Margaret dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she insisted was simply catching dust. A collection of soldiers from the clinic, seated proudly among the aristocratic guests, several of them fighting visible emotion as the man who'd changed their circumstances made his own vows of devotion in return. Lady Corwin was notably absent, having quietly removed herself from London society altogether following the scandal of her exposed rumors, a fact that troubled neither Julian nor Beatrice in the slightest. The clinic, in the months following the wedding, grew considerably beyond its original gatehouse walls. Funded properly now and staffed with trained physicians, Julian insisted on hiring outright rather than relying on Beatrice's determination alone. She continued her work there daily, Duchess of Ellisford now in title, though she never once let the title change how she treated the soldiers who came through those doors seeking help rather than pity. Julian's leg never fully healed, and some evenings the old pain still caught him unexpectedly, a reminder of the battle that had shaped so much of who he'd become. But he no longer hid those moments from her, no longer flinched from being seen at his weakest, and Beatrice never once looked away, not from his pain, not from his scars, not from the quiet, vulnerable moments that had first drawn her to kneel beside him on that ballroom floor so many months before. On the anniversary of that first ball, they returned to the same house where it had all begun, now hosting their own gathering rather than attending as guests. Julian stood near the top of the same staircase where he'd once fallen, watching Beatrice move through the crowd below, laughing easily with soldiers and society ladies alike, entirely herself regardless of the company. "Do you ever think about that night?" Margaret asked, coming to stand beside him, older now but no less sharp in her observations. "Every day," Julian admitted. "I think about how close I came to letting pride keep me from ever knowing her properly. I think about how easily I might have accepted your original counsel and walked away before anything real had the chance to grow." "You didn't, though," Margaret said. "No," Julian agreed, watching as Beatrice glanced up, caught his eye across the crowded room, and smiled in a way that still, after all these months, made something warm settle in his chest. "I didn't look away." He made his way down to her slowly, the old limp still present, but no longer something he tried to hide or apologize for, and found her waiting at the bottom of the stairs with the same steady, unflinching attention she'd offered him from the very first moment their story began. "Your Grace," she said, teasing, echoing the formal address she'd used that very first night. "Your Grace," he returned, taking her hand. Around them, the ballroom continued its bright, glittering evening, candlelight and laughter, and music filling the space where scandal and doubt had once threatened everything. But neither Julian nor Beatrice paid the crowd much attention. They simply stood together at the base of the staircase, exactly where their story had begun, and neither one of them looked away.